My name's Marvell Adams. I serve as the CEO of Caregiver Action Network. Tomorrow will be my 3-month anniversary, so very excited to make it to that cool milestone. I have a background, a 20-year career in serving older adults and caregivers. I've done that everything from starting off in my early 20s as a nursing home administrator, retirement communities, and a few different other endeavors along the way. Just really excited to be among you. Our mission at Caregiver Action Network, or CAN, as sometimes we call it, as you know, is really to garner resources and respect and support caregivers across the country. And we do that in a whole host of ways, not the least of which being the resources we provide through our help desk, as well as other avenues to support caregivers so that they, for their own lives and abilities to thrive, so that they may then be really there for and supportive of their loved ones. We are getting geared up for National Family Caregiver Month that I'm sure you all are aware of in November. And so you may be seeing and hearing more from us and some of our partners out there, but it's just really a pleasure to be among you.
Thank you so much. And we will pop your biographical sketch into the chat. With your consent, we'll put your email address there as well. So folks can reach out, introduce yourselves, and welcome Marvell to this wonderful community. All right. So now we'll dig into the next part of our program today. We hear about cell and gene therapies a lot, and often in the same sentence or the same phrase, as if they're sort of one and the same. But in fact, they are distinct and have very unique aspects. And these are cutting edge treatments that have really changed the face of medicine and treatment as we know it just over the last few years. I know many of you know I went to pharmacy school, and I always say I went before anything ended in mab. So this is far beyond the mab and really the cutting edge and the new frontier of medicine. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Hannah Zaghloul. I hope I said that correctly. Zaghloul, who is a doctor of pharmacy, medical science liaison with the U.S. Medical Hematology and Cell Therapy team at Bristol Myers Squibb. She's going to spend about 15 minutes talking to us about cell therapies and how they work. I think of therapies as pills, right? Little widgets that go home with a patient and they take them on a regular basis. But certainly we know there's so much more when it comes to cell therapy. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Does everyone hear me okay and see the screen? I shared my presentation. Hopefully that's working. Perfect. All right, so as you stated, there has been a lot of innovation in this field. And thank you so much for the introduction and allowing me to speak very briefly about the complexities of cell therapy. I wish it was as straightforward as something that you consider off the shelf, but there's a lot of complex nature behind it from the science perspective as well as the logistics of administration. And I hope to give you a glimpse of that with today's presentation. So we'll go ahead and start off. We start off here just saying the promise of personalized medicine. I think personalized medicine has been something that's been talked about for several years now, specifically in the oncology world. You mentioned MABs and the era of MABs, and MABs continue to be a very hot topic. But this targeting and using a patient's own immune system cells to combat the cancer is a whole nother frontier of innovation, and that's where CAR T cells come into place. All right, so just a little bit about me and my role. So I work for Bristol Myers Squibb, and I'm a medical science liaison, specifically supporting our cell therapy pipeline, as well as our FDA-approved products. I went to Dr. Pharmacy School at UNC Chapel Hill, go Heels, and since then have worked several years in the hematology oncology space. And so I spent more than a decade in the hospital treating patients that were undergoing stem cell transplant, as well as cell therapy and lymphoma, multiple myeloma, and leukemia. And then for the past 3 years, I've been working now with Bristol Myers and supporting many of our physician data discussions, as well as supporting the many ongoing clinical trials and future clinical trials that are in development. And with that, I also work specifically with sites in the area that are interested in onboarding our CAR T cell products. either from the clinical trial perspective or from those that are FDA approved. And so I wanted to start off by showing a picture. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can see here on the left, this is a picture of a PET scan of a patient that unfortunately had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and a specific aggressive type, diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And you don't have to be a radiologist to see. I mean, all these black spots in the patient's body, this is all the disease, and these are the cancers that's in this patient here. Now, this patient had undergone different types of treatment and unfortunately was not able to respond to many of them, or had responded for a brief time and then relapsed. And so this is where CAR T cells were introduced to the patient. So after the patient had seen several different lines of therapy, they were administered with CAR T cells. And the picture here on the left shows you the PET scan that was done a month after the CAR T cell infusion. And again, you don't have to be a radiologist to see that there is a very drastic difference. The picture here on the left after CAR T cell shows that the patient had responded extremely well to the infusion. And that brings us to kind of where we are now. So you may have heard, you may not have heard about CAR T cells already, but they've been in the news now for a bit of time. You see different snippets of headlines here on the slide, just kind of discussing this last hope for many patients in the clinical trial setting had been with treatment of CAR T cells. And many people have been lucky to respond. And so that takes us, I think, to the discussion that we'll have after my presentation about policies and how to make sure that we remain accessible for patients to receive these types of therapies. So CAR T cells, as you can imagine, have been in development for quite a long time. It's been decades of research and development for these products. From the first CAR T cells in the 1980s to when the first CAR T cell was actually FDA approved in 2017. I actually have to say that this slide is a bit outdated in that it stops at 2020. And from 2020 to today, there have been even more, hundreds more clinical trials now looking at CAR T cells in different disease states, different targets, as well as different manufacturing platforms. So it's been really, this is an age of innovation. I think at this point we are at the tip of the iceberg, and I'll explain a little bit more as we get into the presentation where we think the future is going. So I've said the word CAR T a lot. And so you may be asking, you may already know, or you may be asking, what in the world is CAR T? Is it a new type of Tesla car or what exactly? Well, so CAR T actually represents a living drug with potential therapeutic effects. And so I want, maybe starting off to think of it as kind of two distinct things. One is the CAR component, which stands for chimeric antigen receptor. We call it CAR. And the other component is the T cell. So your T cells are endogenous immune cells, so they're in everybody's immune system, and they're a type of cell that is used to combat, different antigens and different targets or things that may be interfering in the body that aren't supposed to be there. So your T cell is part of your immune system. The CAR, or chimeric antigen receptor, is a protein that is then manufactured and bound to the T cell. And so it is then bound to a normal T cell. And this combination of the two allows for the T cell to target a specific target that is seen on a specific type of cancer cell. And so this picture here on the right, you see the T cell in gray, and then the colorful structure there is the chimeric antigen receptor, or the CAR. And there's several different components to a chimeric antigen receptor that I'm not going to go into too much detail today, but just to give you a kind of a diagram of what it looks like. The chimeric antigen receptor, or CAR, is bound to the T cell. Once bound to the T cell in the manufacturing site, they're then expanded and then sent off and then given to the patient. Once they're infused, these now CAR T cells will then expand in the body and target those specific receptors that are on the cancer cells. So they're very specialized, very specific to not only that patient, but also their cancer cell. These cells also, when infused, they, like I mentioned, they expand, and they expand into the millions of cells, and they continue to attack those cancer cells. So again, pictures are worth 1,000 words, and you can see here a picture of a CAR T cell meeting its target with the cancer cell. And I have to mention that this infusion of cells is a one-time infusion. So this is not something that's done repeatedly. This is done one time for the patient, either in a clinic type setting or a hospital setting, and then patients are monitored thereafter. So again, a one-time infusion for patients who historically had to receive chemotherapy or continuous therapy every month, every 2 weeks or so for an extended amount of time. So the CAR T cell infusion is a one-time infusion, and the persistence and proliferation or replication of those CAR T cells is what keeps it active. And so once they're infused into the body, they then divide out, they replicate, and they can last for an extended period of time in a cancer patient and continue to target those cancer cells. And so again, you see the picture here of the CAR T cell targeting those cancer cells. So I mentioned that the science behind it is quite complex, but also what is complex is the logistics and the administration. And that is, again, because of how personalized these therapies are. So this picture kind of takes us step by step through that process. And I want to navigate you through this patient journey that patients go through. So how does the CAR T cell therapy work and how is it manufactured? The very first step is that you have a patient who is identified to be appropriate to receive the CAR T cells. They first undergo the process of apheresis, or the T cells, again, those immune system cells or T cells are removed from the patient. They're then transported either via by plane or by truck, as depicted in this picture, to the manufacturing site. So once at the manufacturing site, the patient's T cells, again, these are specific to the patient, they are then activated. So in this picture under number 3, you can see the red T cell go to a green T cell, meaning that it's activated. And then they're transduced. And what that means is different companies will use different mechanisms, but generally speaking, at that point, the transduction process and the manufacturing process includes the binding of the use of the chimeric antigen receptor and the engineering of the chimeric antigen receptor in combination with the T cells. And that point, it becomes the CAR T cell. And that's what's depicted under number 4 in the blue. So our CAR T cell is now in blue. The next step, number 5, is the expansion of those cells. So still at the manufacturing site, the CAR T cell is then gone from a few cells to millions of cells. And those are expanded again at the manufacturing site. And that is essentially what's considered the dose. So when you think of a traditional medication, you think of the dose of the medication in milligrams or grams. For CAR T cells, it's in the millions. It's the millions of cells. That's kind of the dose that you think of for that therapy. So those cells are then expanded, and then once expanded, they're frozen and sent back to the infusion site. And then number 7, they're then infused to the patient. So again, a one-time infusion of these CAR T cells are given to the patient. And from that point on, patients are monitored. And so they do need to be closely monitored because of the different type of adverse events and side effects that occur with CAR T cells. It is important that patients are monitored closely in those initial days following the infusion. So when we compare the process that I just went through to what you think of with a traditional medication, that's kind of depicted here on the bottom of this slide. So the traditional medication, a drug company or a manufacturer will develop the medication in the manufacturing site. It is then worked through wholesalers, gone through different providers, and then sent out to pharmacies and clinics and hospitals, and then it ends up to the patient. And so it's what you traditionally think of an off-the-shelf type product. So something that someone could pick up off the shelf and take immediately, either via infusion or IV or an oral medication. That is quite different than the process that I just talked about with CAR T cells. So again, CAR T cells are extremely patient specific at this point. The process begins with extracting a patient's own T cells that are then re-engineered and then infused back. So again, a couple things with that. Number 1, it's a very complex process, but it also takes time. So it takes a few weeks for that manufacturing process to occur and the patient to receive their cells. So now that we kind of talked a little bit about where we've been and where we are currently, whoops, Amber alerts are going off, excuse me. Where we
Yeah, I
are.
put in the chat that FEMA is doing their
Oh,
test of the emergency broadcast system. Everybody's going to get a beep on your phone. There is no national emergency. So
okay.
just be advised.
Thank you. I missed that in the chat. I appreciate it. Yeah, so everyone just heard it go off. But yeah, so I talked a lot about where the process has been and where we are today. But I think the most exciting aspect is what the future holds. And I alluded to this earlier. We are really at the tip of this iceberg. There are so many ongoing trials, ongoing innovations, and projects that are being looked at to help, number one, improve the process of CAR T cells from the logistics standpoint, from the administration standpoint, from the safety perspective, as well as how to increase the longevity of the CAR T cells. So again, this one-time infusion is quite attractive to many people. So how do you ensure that the cells remain efficacious over a long period of time? And when I say long period of time, I don't mean months, I mean years, actually. So patients can be off therapy for years potentially. So the innovation now is with, number one, new indications. And so right now what's FDA approved are indications that fall under the realm of hematologic malignancies. The future, though, is not only to expand those indications from hematologic malignancies, potentially having them be available earlier in the line of therapy for many patients, but also expanding to potentially solid tumors. And so that's a big area of research right now, is not, the traditional, types of cancers that many people think of outside of the leukemias and the lymphomas are the lung cancers, the breast cancers, the GI cancers. And so understanding what the utility in the future is potentially for those CAR T cells there. I also want to mention that it's outside of oncology as well. So we are looking at different disease states that don't fall under the traditional cancers, things like autoimmune disorders that traditionally have not been able to be cured. The other aspect is the off-the-shelf product. And so right now, the process that I described to you are a patient's own T cells that are being taken to the manufacturing site and re-engineered. But the future now and ongoing trials are potentially looking at healthy donor cells and re-engineering a healthy donor's T cells to allow them to be infused to a cancer patient. And that may help decrease that turnaround time during the manufacturing if it's more of an off-the-shelf type product. There's other generation of platforms to speed up the manufacturing. And also what's exciting is the different targets. And so right now we do have a few targets that are FDA approved for use in these patients, but it's very exciting to see that there's now innovation for other targets, as I mentioned, in the solid tumor space, but also potentially a dual targeting CAR T. So a CAR T cell that not just targets one protein, but maybe two that are on a cancer cell. So it's kind of like a double whammy against the cancer cell. And then, of course, combinations. And so with this one-time infusion, we do want to find out and continue to innovate ways to keep the persistence of these cells going, despite different mechanisms of resistance that have now been identified. All right, so that was a very quick overview. I hope we're okay on time. I'll see what questions we have time for.
Any questions? I'm glad we're recording this because I'll want to go back and watch it again and make sure I've absorbed everything. It is a lot. Feel free to pop your questions in the chat if you don't necessarily want to bring them up right away to everybody. So now we are going to hear all about gene therapies from Dr. Jonathan Liu, and your biographical sketch was uploaded into the chat. Again, these cutting edge therapies, the way that they're delivered, the way they are researched is just incredible. So give us your song and dance about gene therapies.
Very good. Hello, everyone. I'm calling from London. So apologize for the dark night outside. Very, very briefly, I'm a physician. So I trained in the UK, studied in Harvard for a bit as well, and I'm a trained orthopedic surgeon. Obviously, I'm now in pharmaceuticals, and I work for BioMarin, and we are a gene therapy company, and we work in haemophilia. And I'll be honest, when I first joined the company, I had no idea about haemophilia. The only experience I had was draining knees of patients who bled into them in the ER room. So when I joined, I was really excited to help these patients. But here we're talking about gene therapy, and we'll start from the basics because that's how I like to operate. So gene therapy is an umbrella term. We've heard about cell therapy, but gene therapy in the broad term is a treatment that delivers instructions coded by your genes to your body, and your body can then make those versions of the instructions that gene therapy gave you. Even if you start from the basics, when we talk about DNA, we all have DNA. DNA is the big instruction booklet on how our body grows and how our body works. And genes are the specific individual instructions within that DNA. And those instructions could be to be produce things like proteins. So one of the proteins that I'll be talking about is the one that's involved in hemophilia. And you may know people who've had hemophilia or may not, but it is a really serious disease. And as I said, I've seen people in the ER bleeding out into the knees and joints and muscles. So it's where you bleed too easily, and it's an inherited condition, so you can pass it down to your children. And obviously the child has no choice and they have to live with that. And the reason why they bleed is because they're missing a specific clotting factor, a specific protein. And that protein is called factor VIII. There's lots of different numbers of factors, and it's a very complicated cascade, but I like to keep it simple for myself. And factor VIII is the thing that's missing in hemophilia A. In hemophilia B, there's factor IX, but we'll focus on factor VIII for today. So as I said, factor VIII is a protein that helps the blood to clot, and we all have it, hopefully. And when we cut ourselves, we bleed a little bit, but we stop. If we play football or soccer, as you call it, and we turn our ankle, we may get a bruise, but it's fine. But if you've got hemophilia, that bruise will be more than the bruise, and you could bleed out into your joint, and it warrants you to not only lie down, but you're out for a few days. You may have to go to hospital to get it treated. Why do people have hemophilia? Well, they've got a mutation in their DNA, and specifically it's the F8 gene. And as I said, their genes, they have a mistake in that instruction booklet. So they make either faulty genes or no gene at all. So they don't make the protein of factor VIII. And that means they'll bleed out. And then why is that bad? From a kind of practical perspective, it hurts, and it can get you out of school because it hurts so much. You're immobile, it can stop you from working. But on a more serious basis, it can kill. If you bleed in the brain, that's not a good sign. Also, from a long-term perspective, if you bleed into your joints, you will get early osteoarthritis. Blood is quite corrosive, and I've operated on knees of hemoarthritic patients, and their knees, all the cartilage is missing, and they need extensive knee replacements even when they're young, in the early 30s and 40s. So where do we come into gene therapy? Obviously, we've identified that their DNA, they don't have the correct gene, or they have a faulty gene. How do we make that work? So what the clever scientists have done, we've found a way to deliver a working gene into the body of the patient. So we deliver a working F8 gene and infuse that into the patient. And we infuse that by delivering that gene inside a vector. A vector is just a fancy name for a vehicle, essentially a shell of a cell. We have lots of them. We inject into the body. The vector then finds its way to the liver, the patient's liver, and the liver is a great organ. The liver transduces the cell, so it sort of absorbs the working gene that's been infused, and then decides, actually, let's make this factor VIII. And we've done extensive clinical trials, and indeed, there are medicines out there to treat hemophilia A and hemophilia B, approved by the FDA and the EMA in Europe to help all these patients. So these patients now have working factor VIII in their body. Again, you'd say, what is the benefit of that? So as I said, the factor VIII stops your blood from bleeding out. It helps you clot. So it helps all those sequelae. But what is the current standard of treatment? The current standard of treatment is these patients may have to inject themselves twice a week, 3 times a week, or once a month. And these are expensive injections, they're painful. And even when they do so, there is a chance of breakthrough bleeding. So even though these patients who have hemophilia A are treating themselves with these injections twice a week, 3 times a week, once a month, they may still well get the bleed into the knees, into the ankles, into the muscles, and, you know, God forbid, come into the guts and into the brain as well. So what gene therapy hopes to achieve is to permit these patients to be off these regular injections and live a life that's hemophilia free. There's data to show that these patients can have at least 3 years of a good quality of life in the sense that they don't bleed. And there's further studies as well showing even after 7 years after treatment that they're still not bleeding, which is fantastic. And they say when we talk to these patients, they enjoy life, you know, spent enjoying their sports. You know, previously, if you were playing rugby, well, we play rugby in the UK, but rugby, football, soccer, tennis, hemophilia patients have always thought twice of doing sports because of the risk of injury and risk of bleeding. But now, with the hemophilia-free mind and the protection that they receive from the factor VIII that they've got in their body, they can enjoy the sports, the hiking, the cycling. They can go with their children. And I'll just end very quickly in that when we talk to these patients, they use very superlative terms and very hyperbolic terms, but it's real, genuine feeling. They say it's transformative, it's life-changing. They feel that they can live their life as quote-unquote normal people can live. They go on holiday with their partners without packing all their needles and injections in a suitcase. They don't need to go to another country and find where's the nearest hospital, where's the nearest treatment center. They're free. They can go on holiday and not think about those things. So I'd just like to end on that gene therapy is very new. It's very high science, but the goal we're trying to get to is essentially a better life for all those patients.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liu. That was really great. I really appreciated your very culturally sensitive appreciation of the fact that we don't play football in this country or rugby, but certainly some people do try to play cricket, but it doesn't really go well. So any questions for Dr. Liu, feel free to ask. So now we will pull the conversation over to what current policy priorities that the federal government has promulgated will do in terms of providing access to these kinds of therapies and these really complex and advanced cutting-edge treatments. So Kristen Viswanathan-Wolf, who is a bio alumna and led our bio policy team, has gone on to her stellar career at Bluebird Bio, where she now leads all of the Bluebird reimbursement and access work. So we will hear from you, Kristen, and kind of tie all of this together for us. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It is such a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you to Bio and Michelle for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for joining, and thank you to all of you who are listening to this well after the fact. My name is Kristen Wolf. I, as Michelle said, lead market access here at Bluebird. And let me just start by saying that market access in general, even if we're just talking about one market or one payer, even sometimes when we're just talking about one patient, when it's gene therapy, it's always complex. So my goal here today is just to help try to translate one small aspect of something that we are focused on right now as a company because of its potential outsized impact on access to gene therapies moving forward. But it is by no means the only access issue that I know a lot of us in the industry, working with phenomenal collaborators in the patient advocacy community, are trying to solve. It's just the one that we're talking about today. So for those who may not be familiar with Bluebird Bio, we are a Somerville, Massachusetts-based company that's just a little north of Cambridge. I can see it across the river. So we really have the true honor of being a gene therapy only company. We only research, develop, and commercialize gene therapies. We have 2 gene therapies for rare diseases that were FDA approved in August and September, respectively, of 2022. So they're currently on the market. Zynteglo for beta thalassemia and Skysona for a very rare metabolic storage disorder called CALD, cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy. We currently have another gene therapy for our biggest rare disease indication, sickle cell disease, that's under review at the FDA. It's a very exciting time to be in gene therapy. We're not the only gene therapy that is targeting sickle cell disease under review at the FDA. So we're very excited for the promising world hopefully we'll enter 2024 with. That said, I think we can all agree that these therapies are not worth much if patients can't get access to them in the real world. And for that reason, we really work very closely with our colleagues in DC and across the country to focus on how the federal government agencies responsible not just for federal healthcare insurance, so Medicare and Medicaid, but that make the rules that govern all insurance, including commercially insured patients, what those rules are and how they're changing. And are they keeping up with the novel technology that companies are bringing to market? So I have one slide to share with the group today, and I would love to keep this as conversational as possible. I wanted to use the slide visually to ground us because policy can be dense at the best of times. But please interrupt, ask questions. Obviously, we'll have time for question and answer at the end. But the slide is not meant to make this didactic. And forgive me, my company uses Teams, so I'm always a little bit ham-fisted when it comes to putting things up on Zoom.
Yep, we see it. That's good.
Perfect. Okay, so anytime that's, and what we're talking about today specifically is the impact that a CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, proposed rule could have specifically on some of the most vulnerable patients that are out there, Medicaid beneficiaries. Anytime that CMS and Medicaid, as we all know, is a partnership program between the federal government, so federal rules, a federal standard on one hand, but then the 50 states get to interpret and really implement those federal rules. So partnership program between CMS and the states, Bluebird and a lot of the companies and Bio certainly work at the CMS level and with individual states. Anytime that CMS wants to change the Medicaid program or propose changing the Medicaid program, they have to go through what's called notice and comment rulemaking. And this is just a series of prescribed steps and timelines for getting public feedback. It's actually great that they have to do this because it gives all of us the opportunity to engage the decision makers with insights and information that they may not otherwise have. So on May 25th of this year, it might have been May 26th, forgive me for not exactly remembering, CMS released a proposed rule. And the proposed rule, it was focused on the Medicaid drug rebate program, which is the part of the Medicaid program that really governs how Medicaid beneficiaries access prescription drugs. It was about a change or several changes to the Medicaid drug rebate program. I'm only highlighting 3 here, the 3 that we feel sort of most significantly could have an impact on Medicaid patients' access to gene therapies and cell therapies in particular. There were other pieces of the rule that certainly others care a lot about, but for us, we're just not as directly relevant to the patient access concerns that we have. So these were the 3 provisions. I really want to do a deeper dive on the covered outpatient drug piece, which is the 3rd here. So I'm going to speed through the first 2. Happy to come back to them if there are specific questions. But the first, all the way on the left here, the first proposal that I wanted to review from this proposed rule. So it came out May 25th. There was a 2-month public comment period in which stakeholders had an opportunity to write and submit to the record, really submit to CMS their thoughts on CMS's proposals. That comment period closed at the end of July. And now CMS is in the process of taking all of that feedback, collating it, deciding whether or not to move forward from proposed rule to final rule, and what to put in that final rule if they do move forward. If they do come out with a final rule, it could be any day now, quite frankly. There's a 60-day display requirement, so the rule has to be publicly available for 60 days before it gets implemented. So if it were to be finalized relatively shortly, it could actually be effective and affecting Medicaid patients' access to cell and gene therapies as early as January 1. And that's why this conversation is so well-timed today. So the first of the three provisions to cover is the stacking of cumulative discounts and best price. Bear with me, I know those were a lot of English words, but together they may not have made that much sense. So in the Medicaid program, there is a requirement of that manufacturers, developers of medicines participate in the program. If you participate in the program, then a state Medicaid agency has to cover that manufacturer's therapies, and in exchange, gets money back. The government has a specific formula for calculating how much money back the manufacturer will pay, and that really sets a sort of a maximum amount that Medicaid will pay for the drug. Currently, the way that best price, and the idea behind this was Medicaid should be able to, as a government-backed program funded by taxpayers, it should be able to take advantage of the best price that a manufacturer offers to any payer, commercial, Medicare, et cetera. The best price that's out there on the market, that should be the price that Medicaid pays. So right now, that formula for calculating the best price out there is based on the lowest price that a manufacturer offers to any single eligible entity. And an eligible entity could be a hospital, it could be some of those middlemen, like wholesalers that you hear about that form the channel by which a therapy changes hands to get to a provider. But the lowest price available from the manufacturer to any single eligible entity sets the best price. And then every Medicaid program gets to take advantage of that best price when they purchase the drug. CMS's proposal is to change that methodology for calculating the best price. And specifically, there are a lot of concern. What they want to do is stack rebates. So instead of the lowest price to a single entity, they propose to aggregate all of the discounts on an individual therapy from all of the different entities that may touch it between a manufacturer and a provider, and calculate that stacked discount as a best price. There are numerous concerns that stakeholders have raised with this in their public comments to CMS. The first is that there's no central place where all of those discounts are cataloged. So there's no one person that may have all of that information. And it's not immediately clear how you would set up a system to get that information. So there are huge operational challenges and really impracticalities to implement this. Another concern that's been raised with this is that that's a hypothetical price. No individual actor actually gets all of those discounts. So if you offered a discount of $5 to an entity A, $6 to entity B, and $3 to entity C, you would be at a stacked discount of $14, but none of those entities actually got a $14 discount. And so there are concerns just from a mathematical perspective and how much of a distortion that would create in the marketplace. The second policy that CMS proposed in this proposed rule was something called a drug price verification survey. So right now, under their existing authority, CMS can, quote, verify the accuracy of manufacturer prices for their drugs through a survey. The purpose of this is manufacturers actually have to do a lot of what's called price reporting, submit information to the federal government about their prices. Some of that information is actually used to calculate what the best price is that Medicaid has to pay. In order to do a double check on the prices that these manufacturers are submitting to the agency, the survey authority was granted. The proposal really well exceeds the existing authority that's in law. It goes well beyond that authority in a way that several of us have raised is really inappropriate, to force companies not just to verify their prices, but to justify those prices. And one of the biggest concerns that stakeholders have raised with this proposal in public comments is that not only does it just require a disclosure of potentially confidential information, which is concerning from a legal perspective, but the way that CMS describes what constitutes a price justification in the proposed rule is really skewed toward things like cost and skewed away from things like the value a patient would assign to a therapy, the value of the benefit risk assessment that an individual patient working with their doctor that would do, the value of the therapy to caregivers of that patient. Some of these really core traditional aspects of value that certainly Bluebird looks at when we think about the price of our therapies, CMS gives no credence to at all in this proposal. And so it really has the potential to focus any discussion of value on these parameters that are very static and cost-based, like how much should you spend in R&D? And that really has the potential to risk patient access, because it then skews toward valuing therapies that have lower development costs than those therapies that may have a bigger impact on patients' lives and honestly, overall healthcare system financials. It also really countermands a trend, and this is what was so perplexing, at least to me personally, about it, is that CMS has been working really diligently with manufacturers and with states to make sure that states and companies working together can actually institute something called value-based payment. So basing the cost of a therapy, like a one-time administered, potentially curative gene therapy, basing the cost of that to the Medicaid program on the value that a patient derives, on actual patient outcomes. This survey really has the likelihood, if it's finalized, of dismantling a lot of that work, because it then totally shifts the focus onto cost instead of value, and can in fact make it less likely that manufacturers and states will implement these value-based purchasing agreements, when in fact what CMS has been doing all this time over the last 5 years is trying to make that more likely to benefit patient access. And then the third piece we really wanted to talk about was a CMS proposal around changing the definition of a covered outpatient drug. So right now, the mandatory money back that I talked about, that's part of the Medicaid program. If a state is willing to cover a drug, then the manufacturer must be willing to give this money back. That applies to all drugs that meet the specific definition of a covered outpatient drug. Currently, if a patient, and covered outpatient drug does have a little bit to do with where the drug is given to the patient. Is it when the patient is staying at the hospital, or is it outside of that hospital stay setting? So if a drug, under the current definition, if a drug is given to a patient who's admitted to the hospital, the state must also pay separately for that drug in order for it to be eligible as a covered outpatient drug for the money back. What does pay separately mean? All it means is that when you've been admitted to the hospital, you may receive a gene therapy, for instance, in this example. You receive a gene therapy, but you also receive a lot of other services while you're in the hospital. And a lot of gene therapies have to be given in the context of a hospital stay, because there's a complex administration process. The administration process may be over several days, and the patient needs to be very closely monitored on the safety and efficacy side after the therapy has been administered. So that's why the patient is admitted to the hospital. But they get lots of other services while they're there. Separate payment means that the state agrees to pay the hospital separately for the cost of the drug. And often this separate payment allows a hospital to be reimbursed by the state for the actual cost of the drug. So it really has a very positive impact on the hospital's ability to remain financially viable, that they can actually provide these therapies not at a loss, but at what it costs them, so that they continue to treat patients. This is especially important for Medicaid beneficiaries. So the proposal that CMS makes is that they would change the definition of a covered outpatient drug to remove the separate payment requirement. So right now, again, if you get a cell or gene therapy in the context of being admitted to the hospital, for that cell or gene therapy to be eligible as a covered outpatient drug, such that the state gets the money back, the state has to separately. And right now, the current standard of covered outpatient drug doesn't dictate what the state has to pay in terms of the amount, just that it has to pay separately for the drug. It has to take into account that separate drug piece for that inpatient hospital stay. The proposal to amend that definition would remove that separate payment requirement. And so it really takes away the incentive that the state has to pay separately, because now the state still wins, the state still gets the money back, but the hospital may not be made whole for the cost of providing that therapy. And if that happens over and over again, the hospital is going to have a lot of trouble just from a financial perspective continuing to offer that therapy to patients in the Medicaid program. And that's where we're incredibly concerned by the proposal. That's where you saw a lot of engagement by those who submitted comments in the initial window to CMS saying, we really think you haven't thought this all the way through about the potential impact on direct impact on patient access that this could have, because of the impact that it has on hospitals' ability to be made whole for the cost of these therapies and then continue to offer them thereby. So let me stop there. Thanks for letting me go down that policy rabbit hole. Any questions? I can stop my screen sharing. I think the one thing I just want to leave this group with is, especially on the proposed change to the covered outpatient drug rule, under the current definition of a covered outpatient drug and under the proposed definition of a covered outpatient drug, the state receives their money back. So the state wins in both cases. What's really at issue here is the hospital able to be made whole for providing that therapy to the patient. And that's what's different between the current state of play, where the hospital is increasingly, states are using the existing flexibility they have to pay separately for cell and gene therapy specifically, so that patients can get them where their doctor feels is the most appropriate place for them to get them in the context of an inpatient admission. That is the part that would change, and that's the part that change would have the direct impact on patient access. And so if I can just leave this group with that thought, again, happy to answer any questions, happy to follow up. There's a lot more detail certainly behind this, but I know that was probably enough detail for a Wednesday afternoon. And then Michelle, maybe could you or someone on the bio team follow up with, so the comment period is closed now. We know that CMS is sort of deciding if they're going to move to final rule, what that final rule might say. What can be done or what is being done in this interim period?
Sure. And I think Jack Geiser may be on the phone from our policy shop. We are working closely with our stakeholders and certainly our member companies to really evaluate the best path forward. We really wanted to take the opportunity today to explain the policy implications, again, in terms of access to treatment. I know that this is relatively new information for a lot of the groups, and certainly some groups have been very engaged on this. So really today is all about educating folks and sort of determining our next steps. Ideally, ironically, a government shutdown would have been a welcome relief in terms of at least delaying some of these issues. But at this point in time, we'd love to hear any questions that the patient community might have, or any of our companies who are on the line. Yes, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Kirch from the National Patient Advocate Foundation, and thank you so much. I have to say, I didn't know much about CAR T therapy, and I still don't know much, but I know a whole lot more than I did. And the policy implications were fascinating, and the therapeutic value for hemophilia. So the lineup here was fantastic. I can't figure out how to shape this as a question, but I am interested, since the comment period is now closed, if folks on this call did submit comments, what were the major themes? The policy overview we just heard from Kristen about some of the big concerns was very, very helpful, but I'm interested in any if the patient groups did submit comments in the context of this proposed rule and what those major themes might have been. We did not at National Patient Advocate Foundation because it was definitely territory and terrain that's new, but I'm interested if any colleagues did weigh in. And if we didn't, then I guess the question, oh, Nord is putting theirs in the chat. Thank you so much, Karen. If there wasn't like a huge sign-on letter that happened here, and the comment period is closed, we're awaiting a final rule, I guess, to see what happens next. Am I right about the status?
Yeah, very much. Like from a process perspective, absolutely, Rebecca.
Yeah. So then I guess the question will be, what is that final rule going to say? I'm sure there are some that commented, and I'll look at what Nord said. Thank you very much for including that, but very appreciative for this group coming together, but also the presentations were just superb, and I'm very grateful.
You know, I would, this is Jack Geiser at Bio, and there's also, you know, the potential that, you know, your congressional members in Congress, you know, if you're interested in talking to them about it and letting them know any concerns, you know, that's always something that is important. Especially if it's still percolating, you know, at CMS, and some opportunities to weigh in that way are always, you know, something that's possible. But I would also say that, you know, just because the comment period is closed does not mean that you can't, you know, reach out to CMS on some of this, on any type of rule, quite frankly. And Kristen would correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I also think that when we're talking about this particular rule, this was something that CMS has done in the dark. You know, they have not met with anyone over it. And I think that the timing of it, and when it was done, there was a lot of attention being paid to the IRA. And so even within the industry, there was sort of, I think, a delayed response in terms of how significant this was on both business impact and patient impact. And I think that trying to unpack all of it was a big job. So the fact that CMS has done this, nobody really saw it coming. And when they've done it and aren't meeting with anyone and discussing it with people throughout this process, it is quite alarming in many ways. So I think that reaching out to CMS is not necessarily a bad thing. Kristen, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that either.
I would just say, and I'm going to make these pretty bold statements, in a representative democracy, reaching out to CMS, to members of the Hill, this is never a bad thing by any means.
Mhm.
I think I agree entirely with Michelle that the first step is certainly for us to make the information as accessible as possible, to answer any and all of the questions that anyone may have, so that the potential impact, especially the potential impact on specific patient communities, can be well understood. And that's what we're trying to kick off today.
Yeah.
Not a one and done by any means. Again, very happy to follow up, walk through it in more detail.
Yeah. Other questions, comments, feedback? I see some other folks are putting their comments up in the chat, and certainly just reach out to us with any other questions you might have. We'll certainly continue to share any kind of comment letters with folks. And, we'll definitely keep you in the loop. We'd love to be able to say that there's something concrete we can do as a patient community moving forward. And so I think that, we'll continue to work with you all as stakeholders and with our companies to kind of determine what those next steps would be. Thank you so much, Dr. Zaghloul and Dr. Liu. And I realize, Dr. Liu, that it's probably getting later and later, and maybe you need to go down to your local now, which I understand means pub. But thanks, everybody. Reach out to us if there's anything we can follow up with you on, and we will make this recording available for folks. So thank you again.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much to the bio team.